Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I'm very pleased to introduce Sam. Reading his biography, I learned lots more things about Sam I never knew. I first met Sam when he was Senior Director for Platform Strategy at Microsoft, where he was provided with a bulletproof suit to go and talk to the open source meetings. And he's led Linux initiatives, the open source lab, which is connected to the rest of the campus by a piece of wet string. And so on. So he knows a lot about Microsoft and open source, and really things have changed dramatically in the 5 years I've been there, and really it's a different attitude, a different company, and a much more constructive one that they've actually learned. You know, customers want systems to interoperate, and that's part of the reason. So Sam left, I think, a year or so ago now, and is now Vice President of Strategy at Apigee. But more important for this, Microsoft has now set up, following IBM's example, set up an open source foundation where Microsoft staff can contribute to open source projects. It's now called the Outer Curve Foundation, and Sam, as president of the board of Outer Curve Foundation, is going to talk about open source and Microsoft beyond interoperability. Sam.
Thank you very much. As it turns out, I did not get a bulletproof suit, but I found that a Firefox t-shirt worked much better. It's my privilege to be the president of the board. Outer Curve Foundation. This is why I usually put these things inside my shirt, because as my mom told me, I would break every bone in my body and probably leave my head behind if it wasn't carefully attached. It's my privilege to be a member of the board along with Tony Hay, Jim Jagielski, who, if you're familiar with the open source community, he's also the chairman of the Apache Software Foundation, and Stephanie Bosch, who's a Microsoft employee, the leading program manager behind the .NET organization. I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of those of you who are very familiar with open source, as well as those of you who are not as familiar with open source, give you a sense of the motivations behind the creation of the foundation and what we're trying to achieve today. So first, it's a general rule that all organisms have to evolve. They have to adapt or perish. They have to evolve to meet the needs of the environment around them. The environment has changed, and in a fundamental way, we're seeing new ways to do non-zero sum games, positive sum evolution. So how can you share something that is not diminished, right? If you take a look back to the founders of the U.S. and the authors of the Constitution, the idea was that by lighting a taper and touching your taper to mine, my light is not diminished and yours is increased. So such should be the same thing with ideas. So the concepts of sharing are fundamental, and I know that there have been great talks on open science. Open science, I think, is part of the revolution of open culture that's occurring. I think it's showed up in many ways, but the word open seems to be the key common denominator, whether it's open source, open politics, open access to data, open government, this sort of core wave of sharing as much information as we can to advance our understanding and our ability to take action effectively is the most important thing. The nutshell of collaboration is that we can all add our own ideas together to achieve something that's greater than any of the individual parts. That takes me to open source. When you first think about open source, a few things may pop to mind. GPL may immediately pop to mind. BSD, as we're in the home of the BSD license here in Berkeley, California. You may think of the Apache license. You may even think of the Microsoft public license. Who here has heard about the Microsoft public license? Impressive. It's now one of the top 10 open source licenses by usage in the world. So that's a fairly dramatic indication of the change from where we used to think about open source and Microsoft being on not just opposite ends of the slide, opposite ends of the industry, opposite ends of the spectrum. Some of the reasons why that attitude exists and some of the facts behind it were the arrival of Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Originally, Microsoft went through what people often call the 5 stages of grief. Right? So first there's denial, and then there's anger, and then there's bargaining. Eventually you sort of give up, and you finally arrive at the stage of acceptance, and you say, okay, we're going to accept that open source exists, that it's wildly popular, and that it's everywhere. So I joined in 2004 and started evolving the interoperability strategy, saying we need to start by making Microsoft software work as well as possible with all of the other software that anybody cared to use it with. And that would make the company a greater part of the ecosystem. It would enable innovation. It would drive efficiency for everybody whose life is already difficult enough without having to cobble together additional bits of glue code to make the things that they already want to work together. So I had the privilege of leading the open source lab, as Tony said. Many people haven't heard of much of some of the work that we did, so I'll just highlight a few things. Let's see, I have a spotlight here. Shockingly, not only did we interoperate with Linux by building core networking interoperability, working with teams like the Samba project, creating networking level sharing capabilities between Linux and Microsoft file systems, something that had been going on in the community under the leadership of the Samba community for many years, but we were able to massively contribute to that, find new ways to share intellectual property, take thousands of pages of documentation and access to engineers, and transfer those to the Samba project. That was a nonsuch at the time. We also contributed code to the Linux kernel to enable virtualization systems. So as you're taking better advantage of the hardware that you've got, it made sense that Linux and Windows should all run on the same physical box, and so we enabled some of that. With Apache, we optimized Apache, the web server, to run on Windows. We created interoperability at the database layer with MySQL and embraced PHP. Other important languages like Perl, Java, and Python most notably, I see a lot of that being used in science. I had the opportunity to work with people from Michigan State University and other areas building out high-performance clusters based entirely on Python-based computing. Specific things that Microsoft began to do around each of these languages, reaching out to the individual developers and committers who are building those languages, making sure that that applications written for those languages, once written, would run anywhere, including Microsoft platforms, as a first-class citizen. So that was a big shift for the company. What are the motivations behind open source in general? The first motivation, and the most common of the 3 motivations for using open source, whether you're Microsoft, whether you're a researcher, whether you're IBM, or whether you're simply a concerned citizen or engineer, the first one is pooled costs. We saw a lot of growth of open source before it was called open source, right here in Berkeley, as well as in Boston, Massachusetts, with the development of GNU general public licensed software. Most of that software was around development tools that software developers were using to build programs, but they weren't the programs themselves. This is a pretty obvious place to collaborate. When 99.9% of the people in the industry are not making money from tools, and 0.1% are, it makes a lot of sense for all those developers to say, I want a better compiler. I want a better build system. I want a way to build software more effectively. It's a little bit like if you were a builder, you would want hammers and screwdrivers to be free, and if you could make them free for all other builders, you would do so. That's not the basis of competition. You're selling the finished product. You're selling the house. You're selling the furniture that you've developed. So pooled cost is fairly natural. I think there have been proven to be massive opportunities for this in the science and research community. I think it's vastly underexploited, but hopefully I can offer you some mechanisms that will make it a little bit easier. Competition is the second major motivation for open source. It is a classic aspect of economic competition to identify what is your customer buying from you, what are the complements of that product. So if it's something as simple as a toothbrush, your complement is toothpaste. If you could make the toothbrush free, people would have more money to spend on toothpaste. Such is the case with databases versus operating systems. An operating system manufacturer will tell you, well, the operating system is where all the value is, so we want the database to be free. A database manufacturer will tell you, well, the database is where the value is, so the operating system should be free. So that approach to competition, which I don't think competition is a bad word, I think it's fundamental to evolution. That is an attempt to force everybody else in your space, either to lower their prices or force them out of the market. The third, and I think the most interesting motivation, the most advanced motivation that we're seeing today, is ecosystem innovation. This goes beyond pure competition. This goes to the level where you realize that you may be contributing some of your ideas, some of your intellectual property, some of your hard work into a pool that it will also be taken advantage of by your competitors, sometimes in surprising ways. But when you want to really nurture a particular development in a particular area, if you want to catalyze innovation, we are seeing more and more companies, we are seeing more and more individual developers hopping in and saying, look, I know that this might not be 100% in my own best interest because it's not just a tool that I'm completely disinterested in. But I think that all of us are smarter than any one of us, and I think that we can, the benefits overall of sharing are going to exceed what I'm giving up in this process. Now, many companies get very, very nervous at this step, and many academic institutions get nervous at this step. We have seen many cases in the work that I've done, for example, with the Apache Foundation, where universities have modified fundamental code that is based on Apache projects and been unable to contribute that code back to the community for fear of the legal ramifications of what that means for the computer science department. So I'll talk through a couple of the mechanisms that we think can make that easier. But this being sort of the cutting edge, the outer curve, if you like, of where the industry is at in making contributions to drive ecosystem innovation, it's a bit like stepping onto a nude beach for the first time. People get very, very nervous and sort of cross-legged, and they want to kind of get into the process very, very slowly. But you need to have a sense that there's efficient mechanisms out there that can make you comfortable. Speaking of nude beaches, Microsoft went into shipping open source for the first time just a couple of years ago. So this was a major shift as the company started looking beyond simply interoperability, simply pooling costs, and simply going into the competitive arena, but going into ecosystem innovation. It was incredibly nerve-wracking. But the things that the company learned from shipping Hadoop, from shipping jQuery, from shipping AMQP. AMQP is an open source, high capacity, very reliable messaging infrastructure. It's used by some top banks. You can use it to send messages around the world at high fidelity, high reliability, and high speed for free. These three projects are all pretty seminal. They're very close to the core of what Microsoft makes its money at. So being able to make the shifts required to contribute code to be part of the ecosystem innovation around all three of these projects required some really new thinking. It required some independent existence. It required the acceptance that these projects had a life of their own, that they could exist for their own purposes, and that they needed organizations to nurture them for their own sake. That's how you can start to untangle some of the natural competition and the fundamental disconnects between different people who can sit at the same table and talk about the same project and mean totally different things. By creating independence and creating a way that you can organize a project for its own sake, you can create a more healthy organism. To that intent, Microsoft funded the Outer Curve Foundation. This was a bold experiment about a year and a half ago that a number of us across the company had attempted a couple of times prior to create an independent organization that was license agnostic, that was platform agnostic, that was even, sorry about that, that was license, platform, and even project agnostic. How can you create an environment where any project that represents the range of technology that could run on an operating system could have a healthy and safe environment to manage all of its intellectual property, to get some level of market awareness, and to be able to have the mechanisms that allow three key contributors, corporations, academic institutions, and independent community developers to all contribute to the same code base. In order to do that, what we found is you need efficient legal mechanisms. It's not just a matter of what license you're under, as it turns out, whether you're under the Apache license, GPL, BSD, MSPL, MPL, or any of the other alphabet soup. It turns out that copyright itself is only part of the story. So much like Creative Commons made it incredibly efficient to think about how you would license your written contributions, and the OSI made it efficient to think about how you would license the software, it turns out the way that you contribute the software is what makes the big difference. There's a large project that we launched just about 5 months after we started the Outer Curve Foundation called Project Harmony, which has to do with this exact same issue. And leaders from the Ubuntu community, from other parts of the Linux community, from the Free Software Foundation have come together to address this. The first issue is that you need to deal with patents. Every one of you probably deals with patents, pro or con, and probably both on many days. This is why Cambridge was unable to contribute their changes to the Apache Software Foundation, despite the fact that it would have reduced their costs. It would have been a good thing to get that maintenance out. Their lawyers said, we believe that in this contribution, somehow we will give up an implicit license to all of the patents that have been generated by all of your colleagues within the entire computer science department. Now, us as reasoning, thinking practitioners of either software or science or both know that this is it's fallacy. It doesn't make any sense. It shouldn't happen. It's absurd. But unfortunately, the law and the interpretations of the law are also frequently absurd. So in order to deal with the absurdity, what's needed is to be able to have a structure where you have an independent organization that can receive a non-exclusive patent license, and that all of the assets of a given project can be contributed to that foundation. So we've seen these in specific cases with successful projects like Eclipse, part of the Eclipse Foundation, Firefox and Thunderbird, part of the Mozilla Foundation, Linux, governed by the Linux Foundation, and many others that you can think of. Mono is another such. Think of your favorite really big project. It probably has a foundation behind it. The startup costs, though, to create that independent foundation each and every time represents massive inefficiency in the market. So what we've attempted to do with the Outer Curve Foundation is to create efficiency through a model that we call a gallery. We think of it as a museum. We think of our job as being curators of living and breathing projects. Our specialization is in being generalists. It's not to dictate how the code gets written. It's not to dictate exactly the style of the project and how they interoperate, but it's to create galleries in which many projects can come together, have consistent professional management, have consistent governance, and guarantees over what happens legally. The other thing that needs to happen is fair contribution licensing. One of the biggest issues that occurs when individuals, academics, and corporations want to get together, there's always one whose motivation is going to be, yes, but I want to be able to back out at any time. I want to walk away from the table. I want to take all of my cards with me. And if I get really angry with you, I want to have something that I can assert to prevent you from shipping my contributions. That's just not okay. You have to be able to eliminate that and create fair sharing right at the very beginning. So the mechanism of the contribution licensing agreement is incredibly important. It has to be under the same regime as the non-exclusive patent license. All of this needs to accrue to a single independent entity, and that is what creates a catalyst for contribution. When everybody knows that everybody is running by the same rules, when they are sharing openly and honestly, when their contributions cannot be taken back, but at the same time cannot be used against them. And this is why I think back to the patent lawyers and the concerns about licensing that we see in academic institutions as well as in corporations being incredibly important to communicate. Being able to share fairly also means that no contributor gets harmed, so that you can't take another ad absurdum interpretation and say, such and such contributor representing such and such large organization gave me 500 lines of code into this project, and with that, a patent grant. Well, I'm going to take those 500 lines of code, I'm going to take them and put them in a totally different project. I'm never going to invoke the code, but somehow I'm going to use that to claim that I'm now a recipient of that patent grant. These are the kinds of things that have a profoundly chilling effect on our ability to collaborate and create open science and open source. What we are moving towards is research acceleration. We have 8 projects in the foundation. Just 1 year after launch, we're very happy to have a set of galleries and a set of projects that represent some of the best of individual community contributors coming together with full-time engineers from Microsoft Corporation and from other independent companies. We believe that there is huge opportunity to be able to massively accelerate research by simplifying sharing. And in the coming weeks, we will be launching a new gallery called Research Accelerators. While I'm not yet at liberty to talk about the specific projects in that gallery, I will tell you that I'm personally profoundly excited about them. They represent tools that can accelerate research in chemistry, in a range of other fields, And I think that creating a home where we can take the costs out of contribution, where we can take the costs out of collaboration, will hopefully give each of you a reason to participate, a reason to recommend a project, and a reason to benefit from sharing the costs, from dealing with competition, and from creating ecosystem innovation in the tools that support your research day to day. So with that, I'll stop, take any questions that you may have, and thank you for your time. I will point out also that Stephen Wally, the technical director of the foundation, is sitting in the back, looking a little nervous, because nervous people always sit in the back. No, I'm kidding. The truth is, Stephen is far too old to be nervous, but he and I can both answer any questions.
That's okay. Hi, Caitlin Thaney from Macmillan, formerly of Creative Commons, especially in the sciences. So
thank you.
This is a wonderful, wonderful talk, and it plays to a lot of my sort of passions and things. But I wanted to go back, and again, this is all with the disclaimer that I haven't looked very deeply at, the Outer Curve Foundation, so apologies if I'm kind of preaching to the choir and just repeating things. But I was wondering, when you talked about the fair contribution licensing, this was a nut that we tried to crack, because as you know all too well, the social issues, probably the social and behavioral issues are probably the biggest things to try to fix, and sometimes technology and things aren't just adequate. I was wondering what your thought was behind the agreement instead of taking kind of a norms approach. For example, when we were kind of putting together our data sharing policy for Creative Commons, we found that having it be, trying to enforce behavior through like another sort of contract or license actually just made it more difficult down the road when it came to being able to scale and interoperate with other sort of systems. And so we kind of
in order
decided
to scale and interoperate with other
systems, whether it was for data,
Sure.
whether it was for content, things like that. So we decided to take a norms-based approach so that we got the law a bit out of the way, and then we would enforce those same sort of mechanisms through kind of best practice documents and terms of use instead. So I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about the fair contribution licensing, if there are any parallels between that, or what you found your successes to be for
Sure.
that sort of approach.
Great, thank you. I'll try to answer briefly. So I think the most important part of creating innovation is really creating a set of practices that lets everybody have a background of obviousness about what it is that you do and don't do, and make that easy. Reward the correct behavior paths. Enforcement is the last thing that you want to ever get into, right? The license itself is really just it's sort of the barriers on the side of the road, right? If you do bump your car into it, you've already made a mistake. So the best practices are one of the most important parts of our contribution, and one of the reasons why I'm so proud to have Stephen Wally on board with the foundation. So with every project that comes in, and with every prospective project, with every prospective corporation or academic organization that comes in, we take time to educate on the base cases, right? How do you contribute? How should you think? It's a very different way of thinking when you start thinking about open contribution of code. You really have to turn 90 degrees and say, I'm now going in a totally different direction. That's hard for people to do. It's a lot of talking. It's a lot of documents. It's a lot of guidance. One of the most important things is combining a background of skill with being able to apply your solutions to a particular problem. We're still at a stage with the foundation where we have the scale to be able to provide specific consulting to every single project, to be able to do repetitive meetings with an individual, with their management team, with their managers, show them examples of other corporations and other projects that have succeeded in that way. So there has to be, as you said, there has to be a behavioral norm that is created. We don't think that we're inventing a behavioral norm. That would be far more difficult than what we were trying to do. We were simply trying to codify a behavioral norm and bring new contributors into the community in a productive and responsible way. Next question.
Can you hear me? You're good.
Yes.
Gary Sposito, UC Berkeley. Actually, I'm intrigued by a metaphor that you used repeatedly, and you've got it on the right side above the word motivation. You used ecosystem innovation. Could you give me, I'm new to this business, a concise definition of what you mean by that?
Sure. So defining ecosystem innovation. So first of all, ecosystem, I think, is something we borrowed from biological sciences, clearly. It's the set of actors, and I think that's composed of individual human beings who are doing work and getting paid, the organizations wrapped around them that are paying them for the work in some shape or form, whether it's financial or fame contribution, and then how each of those actors intersects, right? We wouldn't say an ecosystem simply consisted of rabbits, right? So we wouldn't say the ecosystem is Linux and Windows. That's not an ecosystem. The ecosystem is the full set of the technologies and of the actors that need to come together to provide a specific solutions in a specific category. So if we are trying to deal with large-scale data, we would be able to look at a whole ecosystem within large-scale data. We'd say we need operating systems, we need databases, we need schedulers, we need mechanisms for being able to get at the data, we need query engines, right? We can sort of build out a larger picture there, and then we need organizations. Could be something like Amazon or Microsoft hosting these, or it could be companies like Dell, which are going to ship boxes directly to you. I think academia is also part of that ecosystem. Driving innovation in the ecosystem. Innovation, I think, is distinct from invention. Invention is sort of the basic research, the fundamental invention of something new. Innovation is really it's really the adoption of practices. So being able to shift how an entire ecosystem is behaving without any individual financial incentive or regulatory motivation is what I find fascinating. So being able to use the old Chinese expression, you cannot control water. If you want to control water, you have to change the landscape. So how do you, going back to that norms-based behavior, how do you create some paths for the ecosystem to evolve along by reducing economic costs through contributing, pooling costs, and directing that technology in a particular way? I hope that's a useful definition.
So thank you. This is great. So I have a question on sort of how this works with people still being, basically in a for-profit world often.
Absolutely.
Do you see primarily people in this sort of universe being basically like nonprofit volunteers, or is there a Red Hat model, or sort of how do the two worlds?
Fascinating question. So there are multiple levels in which people make perfect good profits out of open source contribution. I'll start sort of at the base of the pyramid, sort of the smallest organizations to the top. I'll cover this quickly. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have fairly young developers, right? Often, university students, or even, it's amazing to me. It shouldn't be amazing. I started programming when I was 9, so we see a lot of high school students making real contributions now. They're rewarded in fame. They're going to get a better chance at being able to get into the university of their choice, or get the first paying job at a university. That's the bottom. Above that, then you have individual developers who have become known for their contributions, and they sell their time and materials. So this is the consulting and services model of making money. A very, very tiny version of the Red Hat model, which you identified. Those are all kind of obvious in a way, right? You can use the materials that are free to build new things, and then you make money on the things that you actually build. The fascinating things around ecosystem development really have to do where large proprietary companies are putting together bits and pieces of open source to drive their own profit. Monte Vista is a wonderful example. I've got 5 minutes. Wonderful example of this in the Linux ecosystem. By being compatible with and using Linux technology and shipping proprietary hardware that improves the performance and reliability of Linux, they're able to join sort of proprietary and open models, right? You don't lose anything as the user, because if you get sick of Monte Vista, you can grab all your Linux-based applications and investment and put it somewhere else. Monte Vista gains a lot because now they don't have to go out and build an entire market and educate people on what this cool operating system is and why you'd want to program to it. So those are sort of what we see as the fundamental models of people making money. And open source is a multi-billion-dollar business. Linux alone is a $13.5 billion annual industry. So this is an area where there can be profound profits. This is not simply people working strictly out of philanthropic means. Good question.
Any other questions? I think we have time for just one or two more. One more. Last question. Come on, you have it. Tony?
Tony's taking notes. He's going to critique me later and tell me what I did wrong.
No, I would be very interested to have comments. It's a genuine attempt by the research gallery, Accelerator gallery, will be largely populated, initially anyway, by projects from our group. And we'd be very keen to have your thoughts and how we can best develop a community which builds around what's useful for you. So really, I would encourage you to either get in touch with Sam, Stephen, or me if you want specific things about the Outer Curve Foundation, or about Derek and others in my team about the others. But no, I'm just trying to learn Sam's words by heart is what I've been trying to do.
Well, I guess I'll summarize and say that we at the foundation just fundamentally believe that open source is still just getting started. Every day I find large financial services companies, large universities that are either dabbling or wearing a set of cognitive blinders that prevents them from even taking some of the first steps to really work collectively on obvious projects and make life easier for themselves. There's really profound pragmatic altruism at work here, but most people can't go out and grab it because they can't see where to go. For people who are working in open source every day, I get comments like, why do we need another foundation? Open source is here to stay, it's done. I'm reminded of the senator who in 1913 said that the patent office should be abolished because everything that was going to be invented had been invented. So I really think that there's just an enormous wave of opportunity in open source development. We are throwing our bodies, our reputations, our experience behind making this successful. So it's my entreaty to you to join with us where you have opportunities to take something that you've been working on, where you've been stumbling over, boy, how do I explain this to management? How do I get this through my existing legal guidance? Or even just, I have an idea, and is there anybody else who's trying to work on something like this? We want to nurture that and help these projects get off to the right start so they can achieve their full potential. So, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.